Welcome, everyone. Today, we're pleased to offer a presentation on the value that artificial intelligence and machine learning can bring to identity governance solutions and what we can expect from technology vendors that specialize in this space. We've assembled a group of industry experts to present several topics that should be of high interest, given that they define the future of identity and access management. We have 4 panelists today. Dana Reed is our lead panelist. He is a distinguished engineer with the Office of the CTO with SailPoint. Benita Bouchon is the President and Enterprise Architect at Honest Research. Chris Fields is Vice President of Security Strategy at Pathmaker Group. And Trace Guy is an Identity and Access Management Consultant for Secure IT. And I will pass this over to you, Benita.
Thank you, Katie. Welcome everybody to the 3rd in our virtual panel series. And as you've seen in the first 2, we really talked about identity and access management topics, but our whole focus has been not just identity and access management, but where is it all headed, right? So our first topic was around identity and the remote workforce and how it all fits together. Last time we talked about decentralized identity and the whole concept of bring your own identity, right? And today we're taking yet another interesting topic. We're going to talk about identity governance and what artificial intelligence and machine learning can bring to the topic, right? So just to set perspective, let's just start at the beginning. We all know what identity is, right? An identity could be it's a digital representation, and it could be a user who is working for an organization, an employee, a contractor, it could be a consumer, whoever it is. What they need to do is interact with some resource, could be an application, a website, and the idea is that you want them to be able to do what they need to do. But on the flip side, you don't want to give them anything more than they need. So that's the whole concept of least privilege, right? So you want to give people accesses, but you want to limit it to what they need. So there's the whole concept of least privilege. There's also the concept, I mean, given our times and all of that we're seeing, we want to have zero trust. So given both of those, what do we need to make sure that identities have the accesses they need? But at the same time, how do we enforce some controls? And that's where identity governance comes in. And that's the big bubble in the center of that slide. And really, it has lots of little sub-bubbles, if you think about it, right? There's the whole concept of you've got to collect all the identity information and application information, because governance is only as good as the data it's governing. So you need to collect all that, aggregate it, and that's one part of governance. Then there's the whole concept of organizing those accesses into something meaningful. For example, what we call roles, right? And then if you've got roles, you've got to have some way to collect those, to identify them, and then to keep them current. Because obviously the application space, nothing's staying constant, right? So you need role mining, you need analysis, you need to make sure your roles are current, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that whole topic. Then there's all the policies you have. The policies that say, okay, if somebody gets role A, they shouldn't also get role B because that makes them God. So there's the whole segregation of duties and the various policies associated with governance. And you can get the general picture, right? And now once you've given people accesses, you want to routinely check to see that they have the right accesses and they don't get more than they, you know, we all know this. Somebody transfers, their old accesses stay, and at the end of the day, you just look like your career path. Your accesses resemble what, you know, all the various jobs you've had. So there's got to be some method to say routinely somebody checks it and says, yep, this is valid. Nope, this is not. So there's the whole concept of reviews, recertification. And then you've got end users, right? They might want to say, I want this access. My manager says I have to work on this application. Or let's just say it's somebody requesting an access on behalf of someone else. Whatever it is, there's the whole topic of requesting access, right? And then you've got all the bits and bobs that fulfill that, you know, the approvals. Is this right? Is this person supposed to have this? And should they get it? And once they get it, is it the appropriate access? Next is a very interesting bubble called governance insight. And that is really taking all the information in the environment, mapping it based on behavioral patterns and how things are looking, and saying, here are some insights. We notice that most people access application A, for example, you know, around in a certain way. These are the roles. So there's whatever insights you get because of real-time usage of your governance solution. That gives you all your insights. And finally, you have what has driven most people, right? Regulations, compliance, what are you doing about it? And the A word, the auditors, right? So all of this put together, all of these little sub-bubbles together give us our whole picture of governance. And to keep governance current and know what's going on, you need analytics. And you need, like I said, the insights and intelligence. So that's the whole topic we're covering today. We're looking at, within the realm of identities and accesses, how does governance give us the ability to control the environment, right? So that's what the panel will be talking about today. And I will start with the first question, and that goes to you, Trace, because I know you've been doing this a while. When I started doing this about 20 years ago, I did this for a very large enterprise. I was called in to do role mining and role analysis. And, you know, they had a huge budget and they needed to figure this out. And it took us a year and a half, and spreadsheets became more spreadsheets. And then we got, you know, we put it all together. What do you see, Trace, now? What's changed? Why is there a renewed interest in governance? And how is this all progressing?
Thanks, Vanita. So there's a lot of factors that go into play here, especially as far as the renewed interest. I think one of the big ones is actually just the maturity of most organizations' IAM model. They're now not worried so much about how they're going to provision the accesses, but now they can look at the why. And having that mature model also gives them visibility into where are gaps, where do we have poor controls, what can we see now that we didn't see before. So maturity is one of the interests, and you can also kind of talk about the tooling there as well. You know, when governance was a buzzword, you know, in the early 2010s, the tooling wasn't great, and that combined with you know, lack of real good policies at the organizational level, it was interesting, but not as doable as it is today. A lot of people, again, their IAM model is working, the plumbing's there. Now what's going across the pipes? You've also seen a surge in complexity as, you know, platform as a service and other cloud resources are being leveraged more. Your accesses are spread across multiple platforms. And that can also start playing into what regulations are being used. You know, in my experience, I've worked with a couple international retailers, and, you know, navigating GDPR is a big issue, and knowing who's capable of making those decisions is even worse. You know, being able to pinpoint the right person to make the decision is not a trivial task. And then you have visibility. I mean, you know, the Twitter breach, you know, here recently, they come to find out it wasn't really a technical breach. It was just that there was too many people with way too many rights, and some bad actors got to some of those folks and were able to kind of launch a social engineering attack to get access to these, you know, high profile accounts. As far as the reaction, you know, I've seen that IAM programs expanding. So again, they're maturing, they're adding more capability. So, you know, privilege access is huge right now. But then who has the authority to grant privileged access to someone? So now these questions start to get more interesting from the business side, and it can be challenging to answer those questions without some sort of tool there. But again, as they're expanding their IAM, they're improving their data models, and it basically shows a more clear chain of ownership of different capabilities within the environment. I've seen a lot more role mining now, like you mentioned earlier. You know, roles are changing. Well, roles always change. You know, security is not a destination; it's a road, just like everything else. You have to be constantly improving. So the roles are getting better. You know, as far as, you know, what does this person do in this application, but then aggregating those application roles into, you know, what's this person's function in the business, and that kind of drives the segregation of duties, as you mentioned earlier. And they're also adding tooling. So, you know, I kind of alluded to that earlier about the maturity of tools. You know, they've been around longer. They're easier to get started with. It's not nearly as daunting. And again, if you've already got a pretty solid foundation for the rest of your IAM program, you know, adding the governance tool on top really doesn't seem as scary anymore. Plus, you know, with the times as they are, there's so much more of a larger risk profile out there, just because there's, you know, folks working from home. So it's more needed. You need to know what access they have and what are they doing with it. So yeah, I think that those are my experiences on why organizations are really taking an interest in identity governance again. Chris, in your experience, you know, I talked mostly about internal employees. Is identity governance just for your employees, or is it for consumers or customers as well?
Thanks, Trace. Good question. So, absolutely, identity governance applies to both internal users and consumers, albeit with different levels of granularity. So for internal users, we have more control over their identity and access details, and we typically can go a lot more granular with their access. You know, we're looking at operating system access, application access, database access, and we're going down to the entitlement level. So we also have a much more structured hierarchy, so that when we're trying to figure out, you know, does this user still need this access, there's a hierarchy that we can navigate to, you know, do reviews and approvals and escalations, et cetera, to really have a clean model around reviewing that internal user access. We also are much more authoritative on, you know, knowing when a user is active or inactive. You know, because typically we've got either an HR repository for employees or a contractor management system for, you know, non-employees. And, you know, we can use that in combination of also looking at, you know, hey, if the issues have been dormant, you know, they not logged into their Active Directory or their, you know, primary organizational credential in a certain amount of time to really be authoritative on whether they're active or not. And we can use that to drive, you know, again, should they have that access. But when you shift gears and look at the consumer, we tend to have much less control over the consumer identities. You know, typically, you know, that our focus there is a lot less granular. You know, we're typically looking more at just application level access. You know, can the consumer get to, you know, this app or that app? And it's a much more confined set of applications that we're concerned about. And so from a governance perspective, you know, we need to, you know, have a different viewpoint and make sure we're allowing the consumers to give us updates to their identity and privacy data. You know, it's a typical focal point on the consumer side. We're also looking at, you know, do they have the right application access? You know, maybe that we've striated our users into different levels, and maybe if you're a, you know, a top level or premier consumer, you've got access to a few more applications and feature sets than maybe your basic consumer. So again, makes sense to look at that, make sure, you know, that as customers change, especially if it's activity-based or transaction-based access, that the systems are actually taking away those, you know, advanced features as customers, you know, kind of go up and down in their transaction level with the company. It's also important, even though a lot of companies don't do this, to have a "are you still there" type governance flow, you know, verification to say, hey, is this consumer still, do they still have access to the accounts and devices that we use to interact with them when we, you know, did our initial transaction? So things like that will help us keep our consumer database, you know, as clean or cleaner, as clean as we can, you know, compared to what we're typically accustomed to on the the internal user side. So Dana, maybe you can augment that to talk about, how does identity governance and that model fit into a zero trust model?
I think what's happening is the role of the role is changing, right? And the role initially was, it revolved around a cost savings, ROI, right? Get people what they need to do their jobs because we want to minimize help desk tickets. What's happening now is that the movement towards zero trust is making it so that we must rely on the rule of least privilege. We must get there. And so what we did before was we gave people what I called acceptable access. It was access that the business agreed upon was okay, but in many cases it was just in case access, right? You had it just in case you needed it, because we don't want you to have to request it if you do. And we didn't want to disrupt the continuity of business to make you go spend all that time it took to, in many cases, manual activities trying to get access. What we are moving towards now is this area that I like to call adequate access. It's just enough to do your job. And your job could honestly be being a consumer of your products. It could be being an employee of the organization. I think what we're looking at right now with zero trust is to recognize that companies and organizations are offering up a high level of services or a spectrum of services, and the ones you choose to consume will be different depending on your interaction with them. So this is kind of where, what Trace is talking about and what you, Chris, are talking about. The merging is that we offer consumer-based services, we offer employee-based and partner-based and vendor-based and guest-based services. And so the idea of the role now is to encapsulate all of those things in a least privilege type of model.
So I think, I'll jump in here and talk a little bit about some of the challenges I've seen basically where we've tried to work on governance solutions, right? And I think the biggest one, and I think Dana, you touched on it a little bit, is the whole planning. People tend to think that they can just take this tool, which is like a magic bullet, throw it in, and somehow they have governance. It doesn't work. There's got to be planning. So one of the big challenges I've seen is not enough planning. Jump in and hope that, you can band-aid things. That doesn't work. Second of all is knowing your priorities. I mean, do you want to try and boil the ocean, or do you want to do something small, get it working and get started? People go to the most difficult applications they have and try and get roles and get this all figured out in day one, and somehow within 2 months they want everything spanking new. You've got to decide, is it access certifications you do first? How are you going to get to where you want to go one step at a time? And that's critical. So there's planning, there's making sure you've got pragmatic goals. Then there's the whole concept of roles, right? It's a challenge we all know about. How do you really get these roles? How do you figure out? You look at what people have existing, and sometimes it's totally ad hoc and arbitrary. How do you make sense of that? So there's the whole concept of managing roles and understanding them and keeping them current. Like I said earlier, I had a customer ask this really good question. How am I going to know that these roles that I've collected today are meaningful 6 months down the road? You don't. So there's that whole concept of planning your roles, identifying them, and somehow keeping them current. And then the other challenge is, once you've put all this in place, what are you learning from the environment? Are you picking applications that people don't really use very much? Have you gone down this path and built this very complex solution that you don't quite need? Are your repositories getting fed like they should? So it's all of this stuff around, like I said, again, planning, collecting your roles and making meaningful, decisions as to how you want to proceed. Those are some of the challenges I've seen. And Dana, to take this back to you, how are technology vendors looking at all these problems that I just talked about, and how are they making it meaningful? Because there's support as well coming into this whole, to add another dimension to it all.
Yeah, it's a great question. When I give when I give talks about roles, I always refer to it as the role flaw. And the role flaw was that role definitions were always a static solution to a dynamic business problem. And so the role model never kept up with the dynamic nature of the business. And so roles, keep in mind, they're snapshots, right? They're snapshots of what a user needs to do his or her job today. And what that results in is like fresh fruit. It's good for 3 days, and then you got to throw it away because it's not good enough. And so I always present a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, because we all know the story of when you're done painting the Golden Gate Bridge, you have to stop and go start all over again, because what you just did is now completely outdated. So roles are depreciating assets. The way in which you solve that is that roles must now become dynamic. We have a client of ours that spent a couple $1 million over a year to achieve 90% coverage in their role model, which, if you saw the size of this organization, is pretty amazing. After 1 year of using that role model, the coverage moved down to 50%. So what we see now is that the roles are dynamic. We must now approach them through a dynamic nature. And so on the next slide here, what we're able to do is to look at use artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies to start to cluster users together on what's called a graphing database. So these clusters here you see are actually people that share similar characteristics. By characteristics, I mean what I call entitlement DNA. You have the same access as one another. And so we can logically bundle these people together and build better roles. It's what's called a standard social structure as an organization. And what it means is to get technical, it's a homophilic environment with high modality. What it means is that marketing people have similar entitlement characteristics as other marketing people, especially if you compare them against folks in finance or IT or whatever it is. So just by identifying these bundles here, we can actually now better cluster users. Now, the key is that this is these roles need to be dynamic. And so we need to stop and say, let's now look at also the outliers, the people, and we can go to the next slide here. Let's look at the outliers. Let's understand what additional access these people have that is outside of what the people that do their same job have. It begs the question, if others don't need this access to do the same job you're doing, why do you have it in the first place? And so we are looking currently now at peer group analysis, looking at access clusters that people have in relation to their peers, and we can better bundle it. Of course, we then take this additional access and we put it in front of a reviewer in the form of an access certification or something else to help them identify these are things that are outlying access that this user has that they probably don't need to do their job. Now, logically, the progression here is very simple. We start with peer groups and we say, hey, people like you don't have this access, so maybe you don't either. And then we move forward into things like activity data, which there's a whole spectrum there. People, and I think Chris mentioned this earlier, people aren't logging into this application that have this role. Perhaps we remove that application from the role. Roles start to have insights. We build out what's called an insight factory to help roles become dynamic and evolve with the business. We want to avoid the model after problem. So we actually call this person in red a highly contagious individual, because the last thing you want to do is when a new person comes in, model after that person here, because obviously we're going to have role explosion that takes place. And so usage data is going to be the next logical step. The next logical step beyond that is what's called zero standing privileges, which means that if you are logging out of the warehouse today or the hotel you work at or the bank branch, we will remove all of your access. And then when you log in or via the time clock or whatever, we will give you access back. So if we go to the next slide here, at the highest level of what we're doing is what I call better garbage collection. And it's identifying a third layer of risk around roles and around entitlements that we can never do before without the technologies we have today. And that risk is what I call obsolescence risk. Every single entitlement a user has is like a little bomb, right? It has its own blast radius, depends on what that entitlement can do. If you are trusted to utilize that entitlement, obviously the situational risk is lower, even though the inherent risk of that entitlement may be high. Obsolescence risk simply means if you're not using it anymore, you don't need it, you're not on that project anymore, why do you have it? And we're starting now down that progression of roles becoming dynamic by first identifying obsolescence risk. Your peers don't need it. Secondarily, moving into activity type of risk. It's like my mom saying, Dana, if you're not going to practice the piano, we're going to sell the piano because it's taking up space in the living room and we need to get rid of it. I've got a lot of friends right now in COVID that have bought Pelotons and replaced their treadmills, and their treadmills are now sitting in the basement. It's time to identify that you're not using that treadmill anymore and actually get rid of it and put it on Craigslist and put it for sale. So if we go to the last slide here, the way we're approaching, we have named this predictive identity. It's really as we move from into the autonomous world of identity through the augmented world where we start to build brains. But I think you need to start looking at role modeling, access modeling, identity governance as a tandem bicycle. Right? You can have one rider on a 3-seat bike and it will go. But if you have position players on each seat in that bike, it will go there faster and it will go there more efficiently. And so what we're doing at SailPoint right now is we're offering really an AI approach as well as a reporting approach where we can give you access insights around user history to help your auditors understand and visualize governance in action, receipts, if you will, of proper governance. We want to help you identify what we call Data Explorer, which is key performance indicator dashboards that enable the business. It shares the IGA problem across the business. Think about what Salesforce.com did to enable the line manager of a Salesforce. We want to do that with Data Explorer. What are my people requesting? Who of my people are bulk certifying things? So they are being exceptionally efficient and exceptionally ineffective, because efficiency, if left unchecked, will cannibalize effectiveness all the time. We're seeing that right now with bulk approval rates, certification fatigue, et cetera. And then we also want to take artificial intelligence and machine learning to operate or on both sides of the coin of access modeling. Better access modeling, right? Let's build better roles because we can now identify users and the access that they share in common. And then on the other side of the coin, let's look at the additional stuff people have that they don't need. Let's clean up the garbage, minimize the blast radius of what could happen if one of those users were to be compromised. The Twitter example is a great example here. And when all of these things work together, obviously, the governance problem really starts to solve itself in some interesting ways. Every entitlement I get rid of via my recommendation engine has a positive effect, or a butterfly effect, on my role mining as my peer groups get generated tomorrow. So I'll pass this back to you, Vanita, but that's kind of the approach that we're taking. And I think it's the right one. I think there's a long tail of really interesting strategy here. It's the first time in my 20 years of working in identity that I've been really excited about a fundamental shift in the way governance is done, and AI is that technology that is the catalyst or the enabler to make it happen.
Hey, Trace, so I'm going to throw this back at you because you and I were talking about this, right? How do you think, Dana just talked about what they're doing. How do you think something like AI will help with, say, role explosion? The thing we all cringe at.
Right. So in my experience, new entitlements always handled, that's someone's baby. Someone took the time to go purchase a product. They're excited about it. So they're going to be the hero, the champion. They're going to go make sure those entitlements get into however you're handling your provisioning. What's not exciting is maintaining those roles. So we have these new entitlements. It's almost universally going to result in a new role, even though it very naturally fits into some existing role, or the product, it was a replacement product, what have you. So, and then the flip side of that is who's actually there to do the work. Again, it's exciting to do the new stuff. A lot of times it's hard to get resources to go do cleanup, maintenance, the normal care and feeding. If it's not automatic, it's a lot of times just isn't happening. So, I mean, the autonomy of a machine learning algorithm of an AI is huge, because, as I mentioned, sometimes products are just an update, but that could include a new entitlement. Do we always know we're getting the new entitlements? Not necessarily. Again, when it's a new product and there's someone there to champion it, it's easy. But an exhaustive search of all your entitlements, that's not really something that happens. So the autonomy of it is exciting. The fact that it can be predictive. So, obviously these insights, forget the specific word Dana used, the high modality, that's not how my brain works. So, I look at this and I see very organizationally based, hypothetical best case scenarios. How do roles normally come into existence? Someone from the business and someone from the more technical end or the application owner sit down together and they say, this is what we think. Is that the way people are using it? Who knows? But this is the way they think it should be used. So having something that's actually analyzing the accesses and how they're used, and then making the recommendations, again, because it's autonomous and it can produce this predictive information and give us the insights that it's just very difficult for a human to do. There's some things that robots and AI are much more suited. Any repetitive tasks, anything that require a high number of iterations. So, I mean, talked about the deteriorating value of roles is because they have to be iterated on constantly, So if you have something that does it by itself and you don't really have to think about it other than to approve or deny recommendations it makes, I mean, that's a game changer.
And keying right off of that, right? One of our goals, and I would say the nirvana of, what we all think about is reducing certification fatigue. And I think, Dana, you brought that up. Because what happens, people keep certifying and they just sort of look at it and go, just give it to everyone. It's okay. And that is really part of what we're trying to deal with this sort of a solution, which is where we're trying to say it's just exception-based. You don't need to worry about the 90%, you just need to worry about the outliers. And that brings me to ask you, Chris, because I know you deal with this a lot, the auditors, right? How would auditors, in your opinion, if I came to them and said, okay, I've got this AI-based predictive analytic role thing, which makes sure people have exactly the right things based on, it watches and patterns, etc. How do you think they would react if you were to come to them and say, we're only certifying exceptions. We're not really worrying too much about the 90%. What do you think, in your opinion? How do you think that's going to go?
Great question. So we all know from, being in the technology space, the technology is the easy part, right? The hard part is getting the humans to change and adopt to what the technology has given us. I'm one of the ones that's not embarrassed to say, Microsoft Word has added, 100 features every year. I'm still using the 30 or 4 core features that I need to get my documents out. So, when we talk about auditors and, the traditional model, typically it's hey, let's ensure that, all access is being reviewed. And, it starts with the approvals, making sure we've got approvals when folks need access, making sure we've got scheduled certifications to, review all access on a regular basis, and then also making sure that inactive users lose that access when they're terminated. So, moving into more of a, if I use the analogy that our existing population of identity and access entitlements within our enterprise, let's think of that as an Olympic swimming pool. Well, we can sweep that pool, on a regular basis, which is painful, or we can look at, just what's that incoming, outgoing stream of water, which represents the change in the context. If we could focus there, we can be a lot more efficient in how we review access and make sure that the change that happened is the type of change that's approved and authorized. So if we bring that back to, okay, how do we change auditors from that traditional approach to accepting this new approach? The first thing they want to be comfortable with is that we've got an IAM infrastructure that really is going to catch that change in that context. And if we can prove that, hey, we've got the edges of the pool, kind of sealed and covered in a way that we really only have to worry about the water that's coming in, as an example. I think auditors are going to be much more willing to then look at, that change in context-based model as opposed to the, kind of the traditional review everything, do it every quarter, twice a year, 6 times a year, et cetera. So I think, if I summed it up, I'd say we really, the onus is going to be on us as technologists to make the auditors comfortable that we really do have the tools and things in place to capture the change in the context. And I think they'd be more than willing to accept that and make us all more efficient in how we execute compliance and audits.
That's very valid. That's a very valid thing, because I've been worried about how you present this to auditors. So thank you. But Dana, coming back to you on that, because we're going to put you in the hot seat, because we do a lot of IAM consulting, all of us in this room,
Yeah.
and you focus on governance. So we're going to ask you the tough question, right? Futures. Where do you see all this headed from a futures use case perspective? And what should organizations be doing to get ready to, take advantage of this whole predictive model? What is it that we should be getting ready with, and how should we be preparing our customers as well as, ourselves?
It's a great question. So and there's a lot of ways to unravel that. But I think, let me start by saying, we had a client approach us the other day, and they said, we are onboarding applications so fast into SailPoint that by 2021, we believe it will take an end user 40 hours of their work week to perform governance activities. Now, the interesting thing there is, that's an awesome problem to have. That means you are governing so much. The problem there means that the future of IGA means that we need to be able to filter out the noise better and focus on less, because it really is a less is more type of scenario. And this is where what predictive identity and AI ML services is going to allow us to do is to better identify the outliers. Because when you think about it, you're not worried about what people are using to do their job. You're worried about what people have that's in excess of what they have to do their job, or what they no longer need to do their job. And so that's really the future of where we're going. Now, obviously, activity data, zero standing privileges, all of those things are the future of IGA. I think autonomous identity is the future of IGA. The problem is that while I would love to see a world in which every day I log in and the system just tells me what I need to do my job, we may never get there, because there's always going to be this audit component that relies on role versioning, on role control, manual intervention. There's all these things that will stop us from getting there. But what I challenge people on a lot of folks do not take on roles for reasons that they just think that they're just too difficult. Where I would challenge them is I believe that roles are like an onion. There's hierarchical models, et cetera. I believe roles are like an onion, and I believe organizations don't have a role model. I believe they have multiple role models. Some of those role models are defined by the jobs people perform, and i.e. mostly a corporate role model. Some of them are defined by the business, right? I've got bank branches set up in districts and regions and divisions, and the business dictates who gets what access to what places, and it's completely done. So don't ask AI to solve a problem that the company knows the answer to already. Let's use AI to solve the problems that it needs to be solving. Back to the onion analogy, onions have layers. And so what we need to understand is that users are different in many ways that have nothing to do with their actual job function. And so we need to start focusing there. On a standard deviation curve, I can alleviate a massive amount of certifiable items just by identifying what all employees get versus all contractors versus people in Denver versus people in Austin. A real life example of this is your cost centers in global companies follow the sun. All AI is doing is looking for connections of people and the access that they have. And so what we want to be able to do is to say, I don't want 3 roles or 6 roles, right? Contractors and vendors in Austin that are call center folks, and then those same roles in Australia, those same roles in Ireland. I want a contractor role, I want an employee role, I want a call center role. And so we can do that by identifying the different layers of the onion, identify the access that's accounted for as all employees or contractors or people in Denver, and exclude it. And so identify, exclude, repeat, identify, exclude, repeat. You get down to the core of the onion, which is really what the function is. My argument is that the function is the most dynamic one that people need. That's where new applications are coming on board and leaving, et cetera. The future of the role, the future of the enterprise is going to be to disperse IGA across the business and let individuals do much more micro-grained, event-driven certifications away from the only thing I want people to be doing in bulk on a quarterly basis is shopping at Costco, right? And what's happening right now is they're bulk certifying, they're doing all these things. We're not getting the effectiveness out of it as we need. And remarkably, by governing less, we can actually do a better job.
Thanks, Dana. Any of the panelists, any last thoughts or anything you'd like to add? Because I think we're getting close to time, right, Katie?
Yeah, I was just about to do a time check. We've got about 15 minutes to wrap it up.
Okay, so anything else you guys would like to share? Going once?
Okay.
Good.
There's one thing I think, wait, just give me that 1 minute. Really, I think one of the things I talked about initially was planning, right? And I think part of planning that I should have covered, and I was just thinking about it as we were all talking, is knowing what you have. I think one of the biggest challenges when you tell people go plan your role solutions, go plan your governance solutions is they don't quite know what they have. Yeah. So that bubble of really consolidating and knowing your environment and knowing what you're trying to address is really critical. And that's an area where I know Chris, Trace, all of us have been doing a lot of work helping our clients not only figure out what they need to do next, but first looking at what they have, identifying the gaps there, and then going into what is required. Because sometimes what you think you need versus what you really need are two different things. So I'd like to just, throw that in there. If you're thinking of a governance solution, please first just analyze your IAM environment and see what's required and what you need to do before you just jump in and say, everybody's talking about MFA or something else, let me go do it. Don't. Just think and then move forward.
Vanita, it's a great point. And I think to add on to that, I think it's important when you take on these projects to in a way, reposition the value of what IGA means in your organization. And here's where I'm going with this. There was a large consultancy did a study this is a couple of years ago on digital transformation. And they had what are called digital masters. And they wanted to see what was the effect on the business of people that embraced digital transformation best versus those that did it worst. Those that did it best achieved, I think it was like an 8% increase in revenue, but a 26% increase in profits. Those that did it worse had, I think it was like a 6% decrease in profits, and yet in revenue, a 24% decrease in profits. What that meant is not only the people that are doing it the best are making a lot more money, they're literally stealing it from the pockets of the people that are doing it the worst. So our largest IGA projects are really, they have board level visibility. And the reason they do is because the smart money gets now that the fact that the rule of least privilege has a direct connection now on the profits of the business. And if you visualize Russian nesting dolls, the analogy I like to give is this, is that profits are maximized by customer relationship. Customer relationship is now being modernized by digital transformation. Digital transformation is being delivered in a zero trust model. Zero trust relies 100% on better identity and access governance, and identity and access governance helps rely on least privilege, which relies on better role definitions, getting people the right access at the right time, all of those controls. So there is now a very concrete connection between what used to be a very tactical IGA program and now an overall strategic direction of the business. I think that was never really there before, but it is really interesting. Some of the largest banks in the world, CEOs, the name brand CEOs are being briefed on the state of these projects because they get it. And I think it really is true.
Hey, I'm never going to look at Russian nesting dolls again. Now you've done it. Every time I look at Russian nesting dolls, I'm going to go customer relations. Where do I go? Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I was I was going to comment, Benita, that Dana, that was an excellent, I'll call it the identity value chain that you just walked through there. And, but, just to spur some of the Q&A from our participants, it made me think forward and say, how do we change the way we assign roles based on all of this knowledge? And so, we kind of go back and think about, context and changes. Maybe now when we get an HR attribute for a user, that triggers some artificial intelligence and says, well, something about this user's identity or what they are to the organization has changed. Let's trigger a peer review search, or maybe there's there's something within the environment that we can use to say, okay, let's offer some changes in this user's access so that now becomes dynamic based on that identity change. Another example is maybe a new server, gets stood up in the organization, and through my CMDB, I've got that integrated with my IAM solution, and it says, hey, there's a new server. I bet some folks need access to it. Let's look at the peer group, say who all had access to servers like this. Well, why don't we offer to suggest to the appropriate person, do these set of people now need access to this server? And so, I think that kind of materialized that identity value chain and actually gives us some concrete ways in which we can actually make that access dynamic and evolving.
Chris, it's interesting because I always use kind of a baseball analogy of the who's on first analogy, with Abbott and Costello. But if you look at a baseball field, right, the questions that we are answering is who has access to what, where is the what, how is the what being used, and AI ML is the why, right? So why do you have the access that you have? But the defense is also being extended now, to your point, right? It's beyond the structured assets that I have. It's now into my file system. So what's in those files, who has access to them directly or through indirect paths, as well as you're moving all of these applications out to infrastructure as a service, providers, Amazon, AWS, Google, the China cloud, et cetera. And I always equate it to we've spent millions of dollars securing our private garage to store that Ferris Bueller's Day Off Ferrari, our prized possession. And now we're putting that prized possession out in a public parking garage. And so the access paths to that car are fundamentally different. And so we're adding an entirely new layer of identity governance on top of what was already there. And those resources now are becoming dynamic. Access to them is policy-based, and attribute-based. There's a big change going on in the world that we're all keeping up with. And so I think that the future of IJ is how we bring all of that back together. But it definitely is exciting and interesting to see how it's going down.
So I think, Katie, we've literally chewed into your time, so go ahead.
Oh, such great discussion. It was definitely worth spending the time there. So this is Katie again, your webinar host. I wanted to remind everyone listening that at the bottom of your screen, you should see question and answer and poll options. It's now time to complete and submit your poll. If you have any questions for our panelists, go ahead and submit those now, and I will get ready to read them out to the panelists. So I'm going to end the polling now, and I'm hitting share results. So you should be able to see the results from the poll on your screen, and you also should have the ability to scroll. So, you can see youth 1 and 2, and then you should be able to take that scroll bar to the right and scroll down and see all of the different questions. So I'd like to offer up to the panelists an opportunity to comment on any patterns or trends that you want to call out. Is there anything that jumps out at you that you want to mention before we move on to Q&A?
I think that
one that jumps out to me is.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Dana.
I was just going to say the multi-factor one is an interesting comment. I just think, and I just remember, I don't know if a lot of this was due to COVID remote workforce, that people kind of scrambled to get that done, or if they had already had that done. But that answer actually really makes a lot of sense to me.
And I was going to comment on number 4, workers having access to what they need to do their jobs, nothing more. It looks like close to a third of the folks are having issues with that, and that's kind of the heart of what we're talking about today. So that's very timely.
Anything else you guys want to point out before we move on to the question and answer section? No? Okay, so I've got a few questions here. The first one, and I'll let you guys just take turns answering. Can artificial intelligence and machine learning help with identity governance analytics?
So I think some of that the answer to some of that is really from what we were talking about, insights, right, Dana? Because that's what your analytics are really based on. I mean, your intelligence is really based on. You're looking at what's happening, what are the patterns, you're doing the analysis, and then you're coming up with, here's some insights to improve things. So.
Yeah, we're in the process of building out what's called an insight factory, which is an insight factory can be as simple as, hey, a new job location just showed up in your data. Do you want to add a new role for that location? To something as complex as people that have this role have not used this access in 90 days. Do you want to remove it from the role? So all of those metrics will help us. The other part of it is what we call North Star tracking, which is to better understand the state of your governance program, right? What are my revocation rates over time? Are they trending up? How well are we governing access via roles? How many people have a role plus additional access? The number of additional entitlements that you have? How many people have access to PII type of data? All of that type of stuff is really interesting. This is not necessarily AI ML, but I think there's a lot of tools that we use as an example in, a lot of you said that you believe everyone has enough access to do their job and no more. A good anecdote of this was a bank in Australia. We took our file access management tool down there to look for publicly accessible data that they didn't know existed. What they did was they actually believed that their environment was so good, they actually put a file out on the system for us to try to find, because believing that was the one file that we would find. They didn't realize that we found 1,000 files that had publicly facing data in there. And they literally stopped the meeting and said, we need to go clean this up immediately. This is not a good situation. So I believe you that everyone has the right access to do their job, but I do question, are you sure? And I think that's the real thing that we're trying to offer here, is that assurance that says, yep, now you do, right?
That's kind of the beauty of machine learning, is there's no implicit bias from a human. The facts are what they are. No one can have a feeling about it. Here's the data. It shows what it shows.
Yeah,
and it's also patterns, right? If someone is getting an access and you see that they're losing this access when they change to this other job, you can actually make it happen.
Yeah.
It's not just over time. I'm actually seeing, and I know this is my holy grail, and I know I'm very optimistic, where people will actually not have to do this daily thing of sitting and removing accesses, checking accesses, because you know it's taken care of. Something finds out that it's over, and something takes care of it. That's how I see this trending for me. And that's, that's what I hope. We'll see.
I think there's an interesting debate that I've had with friends of mine about roles, and obviously that tells you how exciting of a human being I am as debating roles. But the question is, do roles have state? Do they have versions, or do they live and die? Like, are roles binary? They live and then they're outdated and they die and they get replaced by something else. What is it that, how do roles exist in a world in which the contents of the role is dynamic? And I think audit's going to drive a lot of that. Maybe they have state because they require state, versioning, et cetera. We can roll back. But in the ideal world, a role is essentially a peer group, and it lives, it's born, and it dies and goes away and is replaced by something else. So it's kind of an interesting concept of roles.
And you can take it as far as you want with instantiations, and you just make this so complex that this could be another 1-hour discussion. But Katie, I'm going to let you decide. Are we on time? Are we timed? Because
We have probably 30 seconds. Let me throw another question out and see if we can get a short answer. Do hybrid solutions with some applications on-prem and others in the cloud complicate the identity governance landscape?
I can take this one quickly. The short answer is yes, and the short answer is no. And the reason it's no is because you are replacing a lot of your applications with SaaS-based multi-tenancy services. They provide standards, right? They provide standard ways of integrating with them. They provide standard ways of dealing with their access. They provide standard ways of sometimes identifying usage patterns. The answer is yes, because you are taking a lot of your on-prem systems, as I said earlier, and you're moving them out to infrastructure as a service providers. A whole new layer of identity governance is there. Workload management, all of that type of stuff of spinning up of containerization and managing who has access to those containers, because containers have life cycles as well. And so it's not like we're onboarding an app for the next 10 years. You may be onboarding a container for the next 10 minutes. So that is causing a lot of change in the industry. So it's a yes and a no answer, but there's definitely a shift going on. So I think you're smart to ask the question the way that you did.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We are now out of time. We will make sure to answer the questions offline that we didn't have time to cover today. The next session in our series on identity and access management best practices discussion will be held mid-September. The topic will be digital transformation and the role of IAM. It was a pleasure having you join us for this panel discussion on identity governance, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future.
And I'd like to say thank you to Dana for spending the time and taking the time to be with us today. Thanks, Dana.
Well, thank you all for joining, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.